In 1930, renowned archaeologist Sir Charles Leonard Woolley discovered the Great Ur Flood in Mesopotamia and claimed that it was Noah's flood. In 2022, in Perspectives on Science and the Christian Faith, geologist Alan Dickin proposed that Noah's Ark was this type of mud heath building made of reeds floating on a raft in Mesopotamia. In this presentation, I will show evidence that backs up their claims. I will make 6 arguments in support of their research. First, Moses' chronology puts Noah's flood in 3500 BC, which is the same date as the Mesopotamian Great Ur Flood. Geologic evidence shows that it was a uniquely large and extensive flood in the region. Second, there are many indications in the writings of Moses and Mesopotamian accounts that the ark was a reed boat. Third, the ark was an appropriate size to save the number of animals of Lower Mesopotamia. Fourth, a computer simulation of a flood in Mesopotamia based on the depths and hills defined by Moses shows that Noah's storm and flood were extremely massive. Fifth, I will present evidence that the remains of the ark are buried under the temple oval near Baghdad. And sixth, there is archaeological and genomic evidence of the activities of Noah and his family in Gabi after the flood. Up until the 19th century, all theologians, including Augustine, Aquinas, and Calvin, thought that Noah's flood was a global flood. However, geologists in the late 18th and early 19th centuries showed that the world's sedimentary geologic formations could not be explained by Noah's flood, but were due to annual cycles of sedimentation. Thus, many Christians in the 19th century believed that Noah's flood was a local flood in Mesopotamia or the Caspian Sea. At this point, there are 4 primary perspectives on Noah's flood. It was a local flood, it was a global flood, it is an allegorical story with spiritual meaning, or it is a myth. And in case you're interested, I made a video at this URL that describes the formation of the Grand Canyon and the Colorado Plateau. Moses calculated the period from the creation of Adam and Eve to Noah's flood as 2,262 years, based on the 10 generations of the patriarchs and in the ages at which they had their children. Moses' chronology, as interpreted during the first 1,500 years of church history, generally placed the creation of Adam and Eve between 5,500 and 5,800 BC, and Noah's flood between 3,300 and 3,600 BC. The Mosaic chronology in this graph is from an 1856 publication by Nathan Rouse, long before the advent of most Middle East archaeology and all radiometric dating. Strangely enough, Rouse's chronology, represented by the axis on the left, corresponds with archaeological dates of similar events on the lower axis, which represents archaeological dates. The correspondence has a correlation coefficient, R squared, of 0.9999, which by definition implies a perfect correlation between events. For this presentation, I have circled the Noah's flood event. With Adam and Eve created in 5,800 BC, Moses' chronology of the patriarchs with 2,300 years between Adam and Eve and the flood, Noah's flood took place in 3,500 BC. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So the Lord was sorry that he had made mankind on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Then the Lord said, I will wipe out mankind whom I have created from the face of the land, mankind and animals as well, and crawling things, and the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. It would be sort of odd if completely isolated people around the world became wicked and violent at the same time. For example, in the modern world, certain countries become wicked at certain times. I think of Stalin, who killed tens of millions of Russians in the early 20th century. There was Germany in World War II. And then I think of Pol Pot of Cambodia in the 1970s, I think, who killed 1 million people. The primary reason that God wiped out the people in the flood is that they were violent. Now, the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for humanity had corrupted its way upon the earth. Then God said to Noah, "The end of humanity has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of people, and behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth." There was one location in the world that became noticeably more violent in the years before Moses' state of the flood in 3500 BC, and then subsequently underwent a massive flood in 3500 BC. The Middle Uruk culture in Mesopotamia was colonialist, materialist, and violent, as evidenced by mass graves in Tel Brak. They colonized and forced people to submit to their will in order to make money off them, and those who did not comply were killed. Their violent behavior certainly would qualify them as people who God would see the need to destroy. An unfortunate consequence of God's plan of destruction in a flood is that the environment and animals would also be wiped out. God said, "I am about to destroy them with the earth," which is translated from Eretz. This greenish Mesopotamian plain was the heartland of the Middle Uruk culture. Important cities in the Middle Uruk culture included Tutub and Eshnuna at the upper marker, at the lower yellow marker, and Uruk, which is just above it. Biblical writers commonly referred to a limited part of the earth as Eretz. For example, there was the Eretz of the Babylonians and the Eretz of Israel. If Mesopotamia was destroyed in a flood, it is reasonable to conclude that earth in Genesis 6:13 referred to the land of the Middle Uruk culture in Mesopotamia. This image shows the ancient mound of Ur, where Sir Charles Leonard Woolley discovered the Great Ur Flood. For perspective on the size of the site, I pasted a picture of the ziggurat of Ur in the upper right corner, which you can also see in the Google Earth image on the left. After discovering some of the most amazing archaeological treasures in history at this site, Woolley dug a deep shaft and discovered evidence of the flood. Woolley led the expedition at Ur from 1922 to 1934. This is the expedition house at Ur, along with many people involved in the Ur expedition. Woolley and his archaeologist wife, holding the cat, are standing in front of the door next to Father Livigny. Max Mallowan, the famous assistant to Woolley, is the young Englishman standing to their right. This is an archaeologist drawing, possibly by Catherine Woolley, who was an illustrator, of the flood layer at Ur. The flood deposit was 3 meters thick at this location. Woolley found Ubaid remains below the flood deposit, which implies that the flood wiped out the Ubaid culture. There is a 6-meter deposit of kilns and wasters above the flood, and then a 7-meter deposit from 3000 to 2500 BC, which is why the flood was dated to 3500 BC. This flood deposit is much thicker than any other flood deposit in the last 10,000 years in Mesopotamia, either in Ur or anywhere else in Lower Mesopotamia. Woolley estimated that the depth of the flood was 25 feet or 8 meters in order to leave behind such a thick deposit. After finding the initial deposit, Woolley's team dug 14 pits and found flood deposits ranging from 3.72 to 0.72 meters thick. Woolley also observed that the population surrounding Ur was decimated by this flood. Based on the size of the flood and the destruction of the culture below it, Woolley stated that the Great Ur Flood fit Moses' description as well as Mesopotamian descriptions of the destruction of Noah's flood, and he concluded that it was Noah's flood. As with Woolley's observation of the destruction of the countryside around Ur, McMahon observed the destruction and depopulation of the countryside around Uruk at the same time in 3500 BC. She stated, the city of Uruk expanded to 250 hectares in the late Uruk period, and this expansion may have been driven in part by immigration, since a depopulation of its surrounding countryside is visible from 3500 BC. Nevertheless, scholars in the mid-20th century rejected the Great Ur flood as Noah's flood. This map looks to the north from Arabia towards southern Mesopotamia. The primary reason that archaeologists rejected the Great Ur flood as Noah's flood was that archaeologists found no flood sediments from 3500 BC at nearby Eridu, which is just 13 miles to the southwest of Ur, and there are no significant elevation obstacles between Ur and Eridu. The lack of flood sediments at Eridu indicated to scholars that the Great Ur flood was not a regional flood in Mesopotamia, but that it was only a local flood in Ur. However, Woolley continued to claim that the Great Ur flood was Noah's flood, as he wrote in the Palestine Exploration Quarterly in 1956, 4 years before his death. I would like to propose a possible explanation for why Eridu does not silt. Eridu, designated by the arrow, is at the base of the Dibdiba Formation. This side view of the Dibdiba slope extends 135 miles into Saudi Arabia, and the slope extends far beyond this figure. Overland flow from the Dibdiba slope might scour or prevent deposited silt at Eridu. For this or some other reasons, floods do not deposit silts at Eridu. As Robert McAdams, former director of the Smithsonian Institution, chose to focus his archaeological dig at Eridu because, as he stated, Eridu does not silt. The current large mound at Eridu built up due to blowing sand. Based on details in the Sumerian king list and other Mesopotamian writings, as well as the lack of flood sediments at Eridu, Max Mallowan concluded, and this is his wife, Agatha Christie, Max Mallowan concluded that the Kish flood in 3000 or 2900 BC was Noah's flood. However, Woolley had argued that there were many floods in this region and Noah's flood should be exceptional and exceptionally destructive. Woolley was deceased by the time of this article by Mallowan, but he had observed that the Kish flood of approximately 3000 BC was not destructive and hardly even touched Ur, with only about 1 centimeter deposition. He also observed that the same transition in pottery that occurred in Ur at the time of the Kish flood was also observed in Kish, which indicated that the Kish flood did not result in the complete destruction even of Kish. Recently, al-Sheikhli drilled boreholes throughout Iraq from Baghdad to Basra. I transferred the locations of al-Sheikhli's individual boreholes, which are shown by the red markers, and transects of boreholes, which are shown by the red lines, to this Google map of Lower Mesopotamia. The interesting thing is that al-Sheikhli used the Great Ur flood layer as a reference date for all boreholes on this map. He stated in his 2017 paper in Iraq Journal, the base of the Ur floodbed is considered as a marker for correlations between the studied boreholes. Al-Sheikhli dated the Great Ur floodbed as 3600 BC, which is closer to Rouse's date for Noah's flood, 3570 BC, than my date, 3500 BC. Notice that al-Sheikhli does not have a borehole anywhere near the vicinity of Eridu, which is the lowest yellow marker. Thus, the lack of Great Ur flood evidence at Eridu was an outlier, and the rejection of the Great Ur flood as Noah's flood due to lack of flood evidence at Eridu was an invalid conclusion. Instead, al-Sheikhli showed that the Great Ur flood extended from Baghdad in the north to Basra in the south, and from Karbala on the west to Amara on the east. There was no other flood that even came close to the depth and extent of the Great Ur flood in Mesopotamia. I would like to deviate here a bit from the main story and look at one other possible piece of evidence for Noah's flood, 2,300 years after Adam and Eve. As with Moses' account of the pre-flood period, Mesopotamian writings list a period of kings prior to the flood. However, the Sumerian king list lists absurdly long reigns for 8 kings prior to the flood. In 1981, John Walton, a Hebrew scholar, suggested that the incredibly long lives were due to a misunderstanding of the Hebrew numerical system by the Sumerian scribes who were converting Hebrew to Sumerian dates. The Sumerian king list uses the Sumerian sexagesimal number system, which is a base 60 number system, just as we have a base 10 number system. It has also been considered a combined base 10 and base 6 system with 10 numbers in the 6 columns. Based on multiplying the number of Sar by 3,600 and the number of Ner by 60, cuneiform scholars have calculated that the reigns of the kings were in the tens of thousands of years. For example, scholars calculated that Alalim, the first king, probably Adam, reigned for 28,800 years, where they multiplied 9 Sar by 3,600 and arrived at 28,800. However, instead of 3,660, multiplying Sar by 36 and Ner by 6 results in a king list that has less than 7% difference from Moses' period of the patriarchs. With this adjustment, the sum of the reigns of the pre-flood kings equals 2,412 years, whereas Moses' length of time from Adam to the flood was 2,262 years. In addition, there are 8 kings with typical reigns of 300 years each, which is what one would expect if lifespans were 900 years, as with Moses' patriarchs. For example, European monarchs have lifespans of 80 years, and their typical length of reign is 40 years. Finally, there are 10 patriarchs in Moses' list of the same period and 8 kings in the Sumerian king list. I don't know where the error lies, but mathematics indicates that there was a decimal error somewhere. If so, then the Sumerian king list also supports the length of time from Adam to the flood. Okay, let's move on to the ark constructed out of reeds. There are 4 indications of an ark constructed from reeds in archaeology, Moses' account, and Mesopotamian accounts of the flood. First, Moses described the ark as a teva. Apologize for the pronunciation. The only other use of this word in Hebrew or any other known literature is that it was a papyrus basket covered in tar, in which Moses' mother placed Moses in the Nile River. Moses referred to the building technology or material as gopher, which is similar to the name for bitumen tar and bitumen application, and to local reed or animal skin or palm fiber boats covered with tar. The date of the flood was 3,500 BC, and boats at the time were reed boats covered by bitumen. Wood had only minor usage, such as for a plank. Finally, Moses stated that the boat should be covered inside and out by tar, and wooden boats, the alternative, are not necessarily covered by tar. So this is the description of the ark. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with compartments and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark and finish it to a cubit from the top, and put the door of the ark on the side, and you shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. So Moses described the ark as 50 cubits or 75 feet wide, 30 cubits or 45 feet tall, and 300 cubits or 450 feet long. So the first indication that I mentioned was Moses' word for the ark was teva, and this is the same Hebrew word that Moses used to describe the papyrus basket in which he was floated on the Nile River. Exodus 2:3 states, but when she could no longer hide him, she got him a papyrus basket, teva, and covered it with tar and pitch. Then she put the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. So both the Noah's Ark and this basket use the word teva in Hebrew, and it's the only instance of the use of the word teva in any known language. Greek translators later translated teva in the Ark passages as a word referring to a wooden box, which is where the concept of a wooden ark entered Western culture. The second argument is not so much an argument in favor of a reed boat, but an argument against a wood boat. Moses stated that the ark was a gopher boat. Make for yourself an ark, teva, of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with compartments and cover it inside and out with pitch. Gopher did not refer to any type of wood in Hebrew. The word wood was added to this passage by translators, but it is not in the original text. These boats in Iraq are kufar or kufa boats. They are made of reeds, willow branches, and or animal skins, and most importantly, are covered with bitumen. Bitumen or tar naturally seeps out of the ground in Iraq and is used for construction and coating boats. The Hebrew word kofar and a similar word refer to bitumen and tar and the spreading of bitumen over a surface. So the ark was a bitumen-covered boat. The third argument for a reed ark is based on the type of boats constructed in Mesopotamia in 3500 BC. Tom Vosmer, who's an expert on boat archaeology, described Mesopotamian boat building technology in the early Bronze Age, which was the period just after Noah's flood. Boats were primarily constructed from reed bundles, but might also have had wooden planks. The reeds were covered by bitumen, which waterproofed and strengthened them. Vosmer stated that this technology had been in place since prior to the Bronze Age. The last argument for a reed boat is based on Mesopotamian writings. About 10 years ago, Irving Finkel published his translation of the Ark Tablet, which has some amazing detail about the number of ribs, posts, and floors in the Ark, length of palm fiber ropes, and volume of bitumen in the Ark. In the Ark Tablet, a god instructed Noah's counterpart, Atrahasis, to tear down his reed house and build a boat from it. Well, listen constantly to me. Reed hut. Make sure you attend to my words. Dismantle the house, build a boat. The Atrahasis epic, and which the Ark Tablet was part of, was written at the same time as Moses in the latter half of the 17th century BC. The Atrahasis epic Ark Tablet writer borrowed from early Mesopotamian accounts of the Ark. In later slides, I will show why I think that Noah's Ark was visible in the Baghdad area until about 2500 BC, which would have provided details about the Ark's construction to any interested Mesopotamian. For example, they could have counted the number of ribs and measured the amount of bitumen applied to each deck. They could have seen that the Ark's superstructure was shaped like this reed mud heath building. The Gilgamesh epic from the 6th century BC also instructed Moses to tear down his house and build a boat from it. Dismantle your house, build a boat. The carpenter brought his axe, the reed worker brought his stone, children carried the bitumen. This passage describes the use of carpentry, reed work, and use of bitumen to make the ark. This is the exterior of a modern mud heath building, which might resemble the ark from the outside, except the ends, which I think were rounded. I don't know if I should make too much of this description, but the carpenter used an axe, which does not imply fine woodworking, but the possible use of some wood planks, poles, or logs. This is an image of a Sumerian mud heath from 3200 BC, which was only 300 years after the flood. As you can see, the mud heath construction method is over 5,000 years old and was employed at the time of Noah's flood. In the next slides, I will design an ark based on the Ark Tablet, Moses, and Dickens Raft mud heath ark. I thought that a rounded bow and stern would be stronger than square corners, so the area of this rounded end ark is 32,540 feet squared, and a square end ark would be 33,750 feet squared. The area of the ark in the Ark Tablet was close, 36,000 feet squared, which is about 10% greater than Moses' ark. The Ark Tablet also states that there were 30 ribs on the ark, which I interpreted as the mud heath beams that supported the roof and base. In this drawing, each of the 30 vertical red lines represents a rib. I added radial ribs in the rounded end sections. So this is a cross-section of the central part of my proposed reed motif ark. This is a little more in detail than in Dickens' paper. but still it's a motif building on a flat base. So in this picture, this proposed reed motif arc is 75 feet wide and 45 feet tall. The pink outline of the circular shape is meant to represent a rib. Notice that the shape is somewhat like a human rib. That probably is just totally inconsequential, but I just thought I'd observe that, which goes around the body. The arc tablet states that the ribs were 18 inches diameter, or 1 parsec 2, which might be possible if vertical poles supported the structure. Remember I said that this is, or I don't know if I said, this is wider than the normal motif, so there might need to be poles in the middle to support the structure. The arc tablet states that the ribs are 200 feet long, 10 nden, and in this diagram, the pink ribs that outline the structure have a roof length of 140 feet and then extend 30 feet in from the ends, which makes a total of 200 feet. The flat base in this picture is represented by the orange rectangle. The arc tablet in the Gilgamesh epic stated that the arc had a circular shape, and although some people have interpreted that in a different way, I think it was a reference to this circular superstructure rather than the horizontal shape of the arc. Both the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh epic describe the roof of the ark as like the Apsu. And according to figure 3 in Margaret Huxley's paper about the cuneiform cosmos, which I reproduced here, the Apsu is a semicircle between the cosmic ocean and the underworld. And although it is an upside down shape compared to a motif roof, it is likely that the meaning is the roof was a semicircle, at least in my mind. I suppose somebody will contradict me. But anyway, it's similar to the motif arc. Finkel described this Apsu roof as follows, and he didn't think that there was a motif arc. Arcs were to be roofed like the Apsu, suggesting a black circular shape consistent with the Mesopotamian models of the cosmic Apsu. Dickon proposed that the base of the ark was a raft made of a single layer of wooden logs with bitumen holding it together. He referred to the construction of similar flat-bottomed wooden boats at Hit, where there's a lot of bitumen flowing out of the ground, using logs and bitumen. However, I added 3 1-foot reed layers above the wood layer in order to lift the ark floor approximately 2 feet above the waterline. I also thought that a base constructed from perpendicular layers of tied reed bundles would provide better support for the superstructure, which is the motif part. Dickon observed that it would be important for the base to be waterproof. Thus, he recommended wood as the best selection for the base layer. One problem with wood is that it is twice as heavy as reeds. So it's not normally a problem in boat construction, but with this type of boat, getting the ark out of the water, the floor, it's difficult. So anyway, I either want to replace the wooden bottom layer with bitumen covered reeds and then overlay it with reed layers, or use Dickon's original idea of a wooden base layer, but then have reed layers above it. I think that the ark builders probably installed some sort of sumps to keep water rising up to the 3rd layer when there was leakage into the boat. So I didn't feel the need to cover the 3rd and 4th layer of reed bundles with bitumen to waterproof them. According to Irving Finkel, the ark tablet described the use of 527 kilometers of palm ropes in the construction of the ark. In this design, with 4 perpendicular layers of 1-foot diameter reed bundles or wooden logs, each reed bundle would need to be tied to each connecting bundle or log above and below with palm strands. And a rough calculation is that this would require 60,000 1-meter long palm fiber ties. And if ties were in both directions, then it would be 120,000 palm fiber ties. And although 527 kilometers of rope sounds like a lot, this number is probably within the order of magnitude of the expected length of palm fiber ties for the base and the superstructure. According to Irving Finkel, the Ark tablet specified 270 cubic meters of bitumen for the Ark, and the metric area of the Ark was 3,000 cubic meters, square meters. So this would be about 9 centimeter thickness. The Ark tablet described 1 finger of thickness at the bottom of the Ark, which is 1.66 centimeters. It also specified 1.66 centimeters thickness for the floor and for the decks, which would be about 7.5 centimeters. In addition, bitumen was probably applied to the roof, agreeing with Finkel's estimated volume of bitumen used on the Ark. As I will show in the buoyancy calculations, the water line in this Ark is between 0.65 and 0.75 meters, or about 0.6 meters below the floor level of the Ark. And that would be 2 feet above. This elevation of the floor above the water line was my design goal. This elevation facilitates drainage and disposal of waste into the water below, and sufficient height above waves to prevent flooding of the floor, as well as acquisition of water from, and as well as providing the ability to acquire water from the floodwaters. So I think there was holes in the Ark that enabled them to access water, bitumen-lined holes. At the edges of the Ark, I added a structure of reed bundles to aid in waterproofing at the edge and facilitating the turn of the reed ribs in the vertical direction. I covered the edge of the Ark with bitumen up to 2.5 meters above the water line, and then used woven reeds above the bitumen to provide ventilation to the Ark. The largest animals would have been on the lower floor, which according to Dickon was formed from bitumen and sand over the base. With the post geometry shown on the next slide, I think that woven reed upper floors covered in bitumen, possibly with beams, could support the smaller animals. It might have been necessary to reinforce certain joints and structures with wood poles or planks. I don't think that the overall process of laying and tying perpendicular flat reed bundle layers or logs, constructing a motif building on top of it, or applying various types of bitumen to the floors, base, roof, or walls would have been challenging. However, I think that applying bitumen or other substances to the base of the Ark, particularly right before sailing, as one Mesopotamian account implies, would have been challenging. And I think it's possible that the Ark was elevated above the ground on stacks of reed bundles or logs. And if so, then they must have been able to move the supports in order to apply the bitumen or other substances to the entire base. The walls of the Ark, as well as the floors and walls in the interior, were probably made from woven reed panels. These men are weaving reeds together in order to make walls of a motif. Woven reed walls could have had gaps in order to enable ventilation in the Ark. According to Finkel, the Ark tablet stated that there were 3,600 vertical supports or posts with 10 inches thickness and 3 meters or 10-foot length, which is half a nindon. This implies that separate posts were used between each deck, or 1,000 posts per deck, which would be 1 post per 30 feet squared. This is a planned view from above, of a small section of the Ark with overall post density of 1 post per 30 square feet. In this design with widely spaced posts, there might have been reed or wood beams under the floors. The reed walls might have provided angular support for the posts. Based on the height and durability of the reed motif structures, which I think reach 40 feet tall, I think the reed posts and ribs would be fully able to support a 40-foot superstructure on the Ark. The question is the required density. This would be the post and room density if the 3,600 posts extended from floor to roof, and this would be 1 post every 9 square feet. And although this looks like overkill, maybe this was the case. God told Noah to make the ark with rooms. With 10-foot spacing in rooms, there would be 6 rooms and the central walkway across the lower levels of the ark. God also told Noah to make the ark with decks, to make 3 decks. And with 3 decks with 10-foot separation, the rooms would reach the top of the ark. And actually, I put the first deck above the floor. I don't know if that's the right translation, but it just seemed like a more appropriate thing to do with the shape of the ark. Scholars aren't sure about the translation there. The ark tablet indicates that the floors were covered with 1 finger of bitumen, which is 1.6 centimeters thickness. And if this was the case, then it probably would have been possible to push the animal waste with a sort of broom or scoop shovel to the central walkway and then to a slot down to an opening to the water below. God also told Noah to make a window for the ark and finish it to a cubit from the top. The word translated as window is more accurately translated as light or opening. Thus, God told Noah to add an opening to the top of the ark. The advantage of an opening on top is that it would have facilitated natural ventilation, being approximately 30 feet above the lower side vents. The Department of Energy described a natural ventilation system as follows. The chimney effect relies on convection and occurs when cool air enters a home on the first floor or basement, absorbs heat in the room, rises and exits through upstairs windows. This creates a partial vacuum, which pulls more air in through lower level windows. The effect works best in open air designs with cathedral ceilings and windows located near the top of the house, in clerestories, or in operable skylights. I imagine that the floors in the outer rooms on the first and second decks were not covered in bitumen in order to facilitate ventilation, or possibly they had an initial ventilation on the sides here. God did not mention doors. Possibly the doors between rooms were woven reed panels with hinges made from palm fiber ropes. And the central walkway was probably solid bitumen for the entire width, but I think there would have been openings in the floor for ventilation, dropping waste into the water below, and for stairs and ramps. Motif roofs have reed bundles laid across the ribs. So these are the reed bundles. Then a covering of fabric, possibly palm fibers, is laid over the reed bundles, so palm fiber fabric. The ark probably had some variation of these layers and then was probably covered with bitumen on top due to the massive storms. One advantage for this design might be that the ark was probably oriented in the direction of the wind, thus there would not be significant perpendicular wind driving rain into the opening. I calculated the mass of the ark based on the density and volume of reeds and wood on the ark, the defined volume of bitumen from the ark tablet, and estimated the density and mass of food storage and mass of the large animals. The advantage of the reed-based design is that it has relatively low density. I spaced the bundles widely in the second and third layers of the base, as I already said, and considered their rounded area. A circle has only 0.8 the area of a square. And then based on all that, I calculated the equivalent depth of reed bundles in the base as 0.71 meters tall. Adding the posts, walls, and roof and multiplying by the density, the unit mass of all reeds in the ark was 530 kilograms per meter squared of ark area. The bitumen added another 100 kilograms per square meter of ark area, and the animals and food added very little. Thus, the water line was 0.65 meters above the base of the ark, or about 2 feet below the floor. If wood was used as the base layer, the water line would be about 4 inches or 10 centimeters higher, which I don't think would be a problem. Let's move on to the fourth rationale for accepting Moses' account of Noah's flood. The size of the ark was sufficient for the number of species of animals that needed to be saved. This painting by Al-Jahiz from the 9th century shows some of the Mesopotamian animals from the 9th century AD. Maybe Noah saved the ancestors of these animals on the ark. This command in Genesis 6:19 was given 100 years prior to the flood. And you are to bring 2 of every living creature into the ark, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird and animal and crawling creature will come to you to be kept alive. Both this passage by Moses and Mesopotamian writings indicate that Moses did not bring carnivorous animals on the ark. The word translated as animal here, behemoth, refers to grazing animals. Commentators also acknowledge that this list does not include carnivorous animals. The crawling animals probably included species of rodents, such as rabbits, as well as snakes and lizards, which are also within the Hebrew category of crawling creatures. God presented a clarification on the number of animals just prior to the flood. You are to take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, a pair of every kind of unclean animal. I'm not sure if I said this right. You are to take with you 7 pairs of every clean animal, a male and its mate, a pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and 7 pairs of every kind of bird of the air, male and female. So Noah was to bring 7 of every kind of clean grazing animal, which would include wild and domestic animals. Again, the word translated as animal is behemoth, which specifically refers to grazing animals, such as cows and sheep, as well as wild grazing animals, such as deer. The verse also states that Moses was to bring 7 of every kind of bird, with no stipulation that the birds should be clean. From the perspective of population dynamics, the initial population of a species can determine whether a species grows in population or goes extinct. I inherited a homework problem in my biosystems class in which a farmer starts a cow herd with 2 cows, which works out great if the farmer does not sell any cows. Then the problem is given a modification. The farmer sells 1 cow per week. In that case, the minimum number of initial cows for population expansion must be greater than 150. Otherwise, the herd decreases in number. For domesticated animals that are consumed and have 1 cow or calf per year, there would be a minimum sustainable number of animals for herd expansion. Likewise, for wildlife, in which there is some death, and there is typically only 1 calf or lamb per year, such as for clean animals, population growth might not occur without a sufficient initial population. From another perspective, a larger number of initial animals would quickly grow the wild herds in Mesopotamia, thus providing a food source for the residents. Unlike the clean animals, pigs have multiple large litters and would not need to start with a large population. And based on my experience raising pigs, I would not be surprised if pigs have been classified as unclean animals throughout human history. God also specified that there should be 7 pairs of each bird species. C.D. Thomas wrote a paper on minimum viable population sizes for animal species. He stated that 10 animals is far too small for viability. He also stated that 100 is too small because genetic variation is lost. However, what he meant was that these population sizes sometimes go extinct. He described a study of bird populations in the Channel Islands of California, and he stated that of populations between 10 and 100 birds, 10% went extinct. Populations at or below 2 pairs went extinct at an average time of 1.55 years. Populations of 2 to 5 pairs went extinct in an average time of 3.48 years, and populations between 5 and 12 pairs went extinct in an average time of 7.52 years. Thomas described another study with populations between 10 and 100 birds near San Diego. Populations of between 10 and 100 birds survive for up to 75 years. So God specified 7 pairs of birds because it was a viable number to expand bird populations. The British Museum described the animals of ancient Mesopotamia, and based on their list, I compiled this table of expected numbers of animals on the ark. I removed the lion, leopard, and cat since they were obligate carnivores and not in Noah's list of animals. And I was happy that the British Museum did not list elephants and giraffes, although there are some pictures of ancient Mesopotamian giraffes. The sum of animals based on 7 pairs of clean animals and birds were 126 wild and domesticated clean animals, 200 birds, 20 unclean animals, and 60 rodents, rabbits, lizards, or snakes. God told Noah to gather food for all the animals on the ark. As for you, take for yourself some of every food that is edible and gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and them. I calculated the amount of food required for each species. I decided on a mix of grain and forage for large animals, grain for animals such as goats, and half a cup of grain per day for birds. This table shows example yearly volumes of food for each species of domesticated large animal. I calculated the total food storage requirement for all animals as 75,000 cubic feet. One thing that I did not consider is that Noah might have brought younger versions of some heavy animals if there was an advantage due to less required food over the space of a year. In addition to volume, there is the issue of storage containers. I imagine that Noah constructed cases to hold food. A normal food storage technique in the late Neolithic was pots. Thus, a significant amount of food might have been stored in clay pots. There was probably much more to the food supply based on God's instructions than just grain and forage. For example, some products such as dried fruits might have needed relatively airtight storage in pots, which might also prevent consumption by insects. I imagine that food supply was complicated and followed typical storage techniques on ancient ships. One thing that is not mentioned in the instructions to Noah is water storage. Based on the technology of the period, I think that Noah probably recruited oxen to lift water from a bitumen-lined hole in the middle of the boat. So if Moses placed a horizontal round pole in the upper part of the ark and ran a palm fiber rope over it, then Noah could have used an ox to lift the flood waters to the upper decks to the top of the ark below the window. It would also seem to be a relatively easy process to construct bitumen-lined channels from the upper container to each room. Once the ark ran aground on the hill and the floodwaters dropped below the position of the ark on the hill, then there would no longer have been access to water through a hole in the floor of the ark. I doubt that Noah wanted all the animals to run free on the hill. Thus, I think that Noah probably reconfigured the oxen lift system to lift water from the nearby floodwaters to a container and channel that directed water into the ark rooms. One might worry that the oxen might get tired of this job, but remember that there were 14 of them. One might also worry that the oxen would wear out the floor. However, Noah could have added a flooring on top of the floor to take the wear and tear. If the animals needed to live on the ark for 1 year, then it would be reasonable to think that God would plan on standard animal pen dimensions in order to avoid problems. Each of the 3 floors of the ark might have had spacing like this open barn with a central walkway and pens on each side. Large grazing animals such as cows need approximately 25 square feet per animal in a barn. Smaller animals such as goats need 16 square feet. After all the calculations for animals, I arrived at a required space of 40,000 square feet for animal pens. I calculated that food storage would require about 15,000 square feet, taking into account how high each type of food might be stacked. I allocated 11,000 square feet for hallways, and I allocated 5,000 square feet to Noah and his family for living space. Thus, the total square footage required was 71,000 square feet. And the total floor space in rooms in the linear part of the ark. So remember, I added in the hallways. So the total floor space in the rooms was 67,500, and the total required floor space for just the rooms was 60,000 square feet. So there is room for all the animals at standard pen dimensions on the ark. Well, right before the flood, God told Noah to have all the animals enter the ark. And as you can see in this diagram, the larger animals were in the bottom floor. And then God had Noah build a door in the side of the ark. Normally, as you saw, one would enter a mudhif from the ends, but the ends were probably not open due to boat construction constraints. And then once all the animals and humans entered the ark, God shut the door and sealed it behind them. Okay, let's move on to the fourth justification. So, simulation shows that Noah's storm and flood were extremely massive. And, one indication is the depths of the flood, but another indication is what God said in Genesis 9:11, I establish my covenant with you and all flesh shall never again be eliminated by the waters of a flood, nor shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. So there's never been a flood like it, and based on my simulations, that's true. So here's a description of the storm, and after 7 days, the flood waters came upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Carol Hill, in a paper in 2006, described the Atlantic storm systems that probably caused Noah's flood. She stated, the Asiatic pressure system normally prevents Atlantic cyclones from moving into the Middle East, but the high pressure region periodically breaks down and allows storms to enter and sometimes stall over the region. When the Asiatic pressure system breaks down, there are typically 3 storms per month, with a peak of activity in March, April. This is also a time when snow melt causes flooding. When the storms stall over the region, there can be enormous amounts of rainfall. For example, a storm of limited aerial extent stalled over the Jordan Basin and dumped 75 inches of rain in 1969. So based on the atmospheric cause of these storms, which is the breakdown of the high pressure zone and the formation of a low over Mesopotamia, such as in this picture, which leads to multiple storms, as well as the length of time for water to travel from distant parts of the watershed, I think 40 days is a reasonable length of time for the sequence of events in this extremely out of the ordinary flood. So this green area is the total watershed of Mesopotamia. Here's Baghdad here and Basra. So this is the lower Mesopotamia region that flooded. The red arrows show typical Atlantic cyclone storm tracks, which are from Carol Hill's 2006 paper. And notice that all the tracks cross the green area, which represents the watershed. And Carol Hill described these storm tracks as follows. During a temporary breakdown of the anticyclonic system, migration depressions, cyclonic storms travel along the low pressure Mediterranean trough to the region of the Aegean, and then still traveling eastward, these storm tracks bifurcate either to the north to the Black and Caspian Sea areas and the mountains of Turkey, Armenia, and Iran, or to the south to Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and Persian Gulf areas. So I think that the initial flooding in Mesopotamia was caused by a storm along track 1 that stalled over Mesopotamia. And then subsequently, other storms stalled at other points in the Euphrates Valley or watershed along the 3 tracks, causing there to be significant inflow from the Euphrates River into Mesopotamia. In this diagram, I have outlined the mountainous areas that might have had snow prior to the flood. The northern storm tracks, as you can see, cover much of this area. I don't think that this area was part of the flood, at least with respect to Noah's Ark area, because I don't think there was significant flow coming down this Diyala River. So I think most of the flow was in the Euphrates and then some of the flow in the Tigris River. So anyway, the storms here are very far from Mesopotamia, and it might have taken a few weeks for the water from these storms or the snow melt to reach Baghdad area, which is where I think the ark was. So Moses described 4 water surface elevations during the flooding. So possibly there was that initial Atlantic cyclonic storm that entered Mesopotamia along track 1 and then stalled. And I'm thinking that caused the 3 meters deep flood. And then subsequently, flooding might have entered Mesopotamia from the Euphrates River and increased the water surface elevation to 9 meters and then 16 meters. So if this description came from Noah, then Noah apparently recorded the water levels of the flood. It is also possible that this description came from God, but to me, it appears to be an observational account. So normally boats in Mesopotamia record water levels by inserting a pole in the water. So I think it's likely that Moses had such a pole that could be inserted into the openings in the ark, in the floor, to the floodwater below. And it is interesting to think about the statistics of this measurement system. So where was the tall hill that Noah measured with a pole? In this analysis, I assume that the third phase covered a 9-meter elevation hill, and then it was covered over by 7 meters higher water depth, which is the 15 cubits higher. And that's not really communicated in this translation of Genesis 7:20, but most translations say that the hills were covered by 15 cubits. This image shows the 3 rivers that feed into the Baghdad area. The Euphrates River comes from the west, the Tigris from the north, and the Diyala River comes from the east. So after the initial storm, I think that the primary flow in the flooding, like I said before, was in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And if the ark had been blown or shoved by water into the Diyala River basin, then it would have been protected from these flood flows coming down from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So this is my scenario for the path of Noah's Ark. I think that the ark started in Shurapak, which is in the middle of Lower Mesopotamia. This whole area is called Lower Mesopotamia. In about 250 kilometers, which is about 250 kilometers south of Baghdad. And the only evidence for this location in historical texts is from Mesopotamian accounts of the flood. But to me, the location makes sense. It is in the middle of Lower Mesopotamia, which would be a central location for the gathering of animals. And I do think it would be relatively important for the ark to be near the marshlands in the south because of the rich biodiversity there. And based on wind and water drag forces in the ark, I hypothesize that the ark moved northward at a rate of 50 kilometers per day from days 3 to 8. And then on days 9 and 10, inflow from the Euphrates River began, which would have increased the flood elevation in Baghdad and caused water in the ark to flow into the Diyala River Valley, where it was protected from the major flooding in these rivers on days 11 to 40. And then once the storm ended, I'm seeing the ark floating down the Diyala River Valley, and then it ran aground on a tel near Baghdad at the Kafaja archaeological site, where I think there is evidence of ark remains. So I constructed I'm an irrigation engineer, so I've done a little bit of this. I constructed a one-dimensional kinematic wave simulation of the flood. So this control volume accounts for the varying widths of the valley. So the width is in this direction, and the length from Baghdad to Basra is in this direction. And so the valley is narrower. I estimated approximately 50 kilometers wide near Baghdad, and then it widens to about 120 kilometers in the middle, and then narrows slightly as it flows out to the Persian Gulf. The distance from Baghdad to Basra or the Persian Gulf is about 500 kilometers, and there's only 20 meters fall in the 500 kilometers. So the slope is very low, 0.00004 meters per meter. Also in the computer model, there needed to be an estimate of the roughness of the ground, which affects the water flow. So I estimated Manning's N as 0.033. So granted, this model is a very rough estimate, but I think it enabled me to roughly calculate the magnitude of the storm. So in order to estimate the width of the valley at Baghdad, I drew a 50-mile or 80-kilometer transect across the valley, shown by this red line. And so then I overlaid the transect on a Google Earth image, which also gave elevations. And so this transect extends from the Euphrates River coming down the slope on the left to the Diyala River Valley, which is just over this hill or right here on the right. And as you can see, the correct width of the valley in the simulation, so if the flood was this elevation, it would be this wide, but if it was this elevation, it would be that wide. So the correct estimate of the width would depend on the depth. I didn't worry about that. I just made an overall width. So obviously I have a very rough estimate of this location. But anyway, I'm not a professional flood modeler. All I can do is simple kinematic wave models in one dimension, where I vary the width. Okay. So in the first phase, I evenly distributed rain across the upper half of the Mesopotamian Valley. So this is a side profile view of the valley floor and the water surface elevations during my hypothetical 8 days of the storm, with an overall precipitation rate of 20 billion cubic meters per day. So each of these lines represents the water profile on a separate day. So it begins low. Here's the ground surface, the straight line. So it begins low and then increases over time. In this simulation, the storm lifted the arc, and I think that the arc had a 1.2 meter draft, or 4 feet, by 2 meters off the valley floor with a 3 meter flood depth. Actually, that was an old draft. My new draft is 2 feet. So this is a conservative estimate. But anyway, I think the flood depth was about 3 meters deep. And so that's when the arc lifted off the ground. And then I think that wind blew the arc north to Baghdad. So these are the flood flow velocities during my hypothetical first 8 days of the storm with 20 billion cubic meters per day precipitation rate. So each line represents the velocity on a separate day. There's some instability in the model, which explains these little ups and downs. The lower lines are earlier than the upper lines. Notice that the average flow velocity is about 0.4 meters per second once the flood is established. And so actually, Carol Hill's husband, Alan Hill, did a paper on wind drag versus water flow with the arc. And so I used that information to calculate the relative drag forces with water flow at 0.4 meters per second and a 22 mile per hour wind on the leading edge of a cyclonic storm system, which, as you know from watching hurricanes, is moving north, pushing the arc northward. And so the arc would move to Shurapak, to Baghdad over a period of 5 days based on those calculations. Once the arc was blown to Baghdad, I began the inflow from the Euphrates River in order to increase the flood elevation near Baghdad and cause the water and the arc to flow into the Diyala River Valley. So the blue line is the day before the Euphrates flow, and the brown line is after. Considering the circular wind pattern of cyclonic storms, wind might have also aided the movement into the valley if the center of the storm passed to the north of Baghdad. However, I wanted to use water for this phase of the arc movement. So the model does not show water moving into the Diyala River Valley because it is a one-dimensional model. However, any increase in water elevation due to flow of the Euphrates in Baghdad would cause water to rise and to start flowing into the Diyala River Valley. And if the water flow rate into the Diyala River Valley was 0.6 meters per second, then the arc would travel into the valley at a rate of 50 kilometers per day. The next phase of the flood was that the hills were covered, and I think that the hills are the tells in Mesopotamia that build up under cities rather than the mountains of the earth. So I estimated the height of the hills was 9 meters based on the elevation of what I think are the remains of the ark at Kafadja. So with the hills 22 cubits or 7 meters under the water, this would be the water elevation for a total flood depth of 16 meters. And so the word for mountain or hill is Her. And an example of Her referring to a tell is what is called Mount Megiddo, which is a 21-meter tell, 21 meters elevation, in a flat plain where the ancient city of Megiddo was built up over the centuries. Her Megiddo is where we get the name Armageddon. Thus, a tell that formed under a city such as this one was referred to as a Her, or mountain in Hebrew. With the assumption that the Her or hill in Mesopotamia was 9 meters tall at the time of the flood, 50 billion cubic meters per day entering Mesopotamia from the Euphrates River would cover the hill by generating a flood 9 meters deep in the vicinity of Baghdad. So this is 20 billion cubic meters per day. This is 50 billion cubic meters per day. And this is 180 billion cubic meters per day. So I think that this phase probably came from stormwater in the Euphrates watershed. And for comparison, the largest storm ever recorded in the United States was Hurricane Harvey, which also had a precipitation rate of 50 billion cubic meters per day. So this flood depth is, this 50 billion cubic meters per day is represented by this middle lines. Now, a flood of 180 billion cubic meters per day, which is what I calculated would be required to lift the elevation 7 meters over the tell, that flow rate is completely unprecedented. So I don't think that the storm necessarily caused this. There's a concept called a flood runoff hydrograph, where flow from different parts of the watershed reaches other parts of the watershed based on the water velocity and so on. And so there could have been a slug of flow from storms traveling across the watershed that did reach this flow rate, even though the storm intensity, but this is a ridiculous storm intensity, actually. That's why I say it was an extremely massive storm. So either I made a calculation wrong in the model, or the hill elevations are misestimated, or the storm was in this range. So like I said, the flood runoff hydrograph might have introduced a slug of water to the Euphrates area if, let's say the part of the watershed that's 14 days away from Baghdad would reach Baghdad in 14 days, but then there was a later storm, 7 days away, and then all the water reached Baghdad at the same time. Obviously, it's not even worth speculating on exactly how this happened, but there could have been effects from flood runoff in addition to storms. So here's what happened in the flood, and every living thing that moved upon the earth perished: birds, livestock, animals, every creature that swarms above the earth, upon the earth. Obviously, this is not Genesis 2:21. And all mankind. Of all that was on the dry land, everything that had the breath of life in its nostrils died, and every living thing on the face of the earth was destroyed: man and livestock, crawling creatures, and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah and those with him in the ark remained. So that was the statement. Everything was destroyed. But it's interesting to think about whether some people survived. For example, I'm wondering if everyone in Uruk died. So my simulation at 180 billion cubic meters per second or per day shows that Uruk was under 13 meters of water. And Woolley thought that the depth of the flood flow in that vicinity was about 8 meters. And the Anu Ziggurat, I think it was about that tall. So I'm thinking possibly people might have survived on the Anu Ziggurat, which had been constructed in Uruk prior to the flood. Well, God stated that he would never again destroy the earth with a flood, specifically referring to Mesopotamia. And this has been true. The largest floods to have flooded Baghdad in the modern historical era are in the range of about 200 million cubic meters per day flow rate in the Tigris River. So this is 1,000 times less flow than my calculated flow rate for Noah's flood. And I double checked my calculations, and that is what I calculated. But even if only 50 billion cubic meters per day, even if that was a storm intensity, this type of flood has never occurred again in Mesopotamia. So the drying period analysis in the following slides is based on the 29-meter elevation of what I think are the remains of the ark under the Temple Oval in Baghdad. So this is a graph of the drying. So here's the flood. Here's the maximum elevation, 36 meters above sea level or 16 meters deep. And then there's a gradual drying over the next year. So there's some disagreement as to the 150 days during which the water prevailed, described in Genesis 7:29 and 8:3. However, I'm going to assume that it is the same 150 days and that the water steadily decreased from 15 cubits over the hills, 36 meters mean sea level, to the ark running aground on those hills after 150 days. In this interpretation, Genesis 8:1-8 describes a gradual process of the depletion of the flood, which is probably reasonable. And using the elevation of the ark remains of the Temple Oval as a reference, 29 meters, the ark ran aground when the water level was 30 meters above mean sea level if the draft of the ark was 1 meter. Draft is the depth of the base of the ark above the water line. The next step in the drying process was that other hills became visible. And as I mentioned before, I'm not sure I mentioned this, but there were 4 hills at Kafaja. And the other hills at Kafaja were smaller in area than the main hill with the Temple Oval, and were about half a mile away. So it's possible that they were lower than the main hill at Kafaja in 3500 BC. I've looked at archaeologists' reports, and they do show elevations of those hills in various publications, but it's difficult to follow. And actually, at the time, they analyzed, the hills now, or 2500 BC when they constructed the Temple Oval, and it's difficult to know what the elevations of the hills were at the time of the flood. But anyway, they might have been smaller than the hill with the Temple Oval. The nearest other towns were Neribtum and Eshnuna, which were 15 and 30 kilometers away from Kafaja. It would have been impossible for Noah to see these little hills or tells poking out from the water at those distances. And I've also talked to people who have been in Baghdad, and no distant hills or mountains are visible from Baghdad. It looks like completely flat ground with the sky in the background. Thus, I think it is likely that the hills that Noah saw were the other hills at Kafaja. The fact that the line is straight is due to the fact I selected a flood elevation of 25 meters above sea level when the other hills appeared. I have no idea if that was the case. But if this point is taken out, you can see that there still is a generally linear decrease in water elevation from the end of the storm to the intersection with the surface of the ground below the hill. So anyway, at the time the tops of the other hills became visible, Noah opened a window and let out a raven. And according to commentators, this was a different window from the skylight on top, what I'm calling a skylight on top of the ark. And the raven stayed outside of the ark and just flew around until the water was dried up from the earth, which dried up from the earth. I think that means when the flat plain at the base of the hill was exposed. I think Noah sent out the first dove when the floodwaters were gone, but there were still standing pools of water in the Mesopotamian plain. And that was not successful. Then Noah let out a second dove, and it eventually came back with an olive leaf. This means that the dove reached an area of land that had not been covered by the flood, since olive trees do not survive underwater for a year. It is reasonable to think that the distance that a dove can fly in a day, possibly about 50 miles round trip, would be within the range of elevated areas that are not covered by a flood in the Diyala Valley or the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Once the floodwaters reached the ground surface on day 317, it took 67 more days for the ground to dry out such that Noah and the animals could walk on the ground. One of the constraints for farmers in humid areas is waiting for the ground to dry out after the spring rains. In order to increase the rate of drying, farmers install subsurface drainage systems. Without subsurface drainage, the drying time is excessive and it is impossible to move equipment into the fields in order to plant crops. There would have been nowhere for the water to go in soaked Mesopotamia. Without subsurface drainage, a period of 2 months in a flat valley would be a reasonable amount of time to wait before walking on the land. And although several Mesopotamian accounts describe the pre-flood activities of the counterpart of Noah, either Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, the only Mesopotamian description of the flood is the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, which was written in the 7th century BC, which has a remarkable similarity with the account of Moses, as you can see in this table. So the fact that the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, has a unique Mesopotamian account of the flood and was written 1,000 years after Moses probably means that it borrowed information from the writings of Moses and not vice versa. Okay, let's move on to the archaeological evidence for the Ark. There are 4 reasons to think that the Ark is buried under the temple oval at Kafadja. First, the name of Ararat Hills fits Kafadja, as I will show. Second, there is an incredible sand layer, I hate to call it incredible, but it is, under the temple oval, which seems to indicate that something incredible is buried under the sand layer. Third, the dimensions of the remains of the Ark, if the walls fell outward, fit the dimensions of the temple oval. And finally, I will show that the material discovered under the Ark layer matches the expected remains of the Ark. So this is an artist's reconstruction of the temple oval at Kafadja. It is about 400 feet long and 200 feet wide. It is on one of 4 hills at Kafadja, which are next to the Diyala River. For those who believe in a global flood, the most popular proposed location where the Ark ran aground is Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey or Armenia. Another proposed location is the mountains of the ancient kingdom of Urartu in northern Iraq. However, Moses wrote in the 17th century BC, and the Urartu kingdom did not exist until the 13th century BC. Even worse, Mount Ararat was named in the Middle Ages. In spite of many expeditions in search of the Ark to various mountains and mountainous areas of the region, nobody has ever discovered the Ark on top of a mountain. This is a map of ancient Ubaid cities in Mesopotamia. The temple oval was at Tatub, which is another name for Kafadja. The Diyala River used to be named the Arata River. Kafadja was the first town along the Arata River. The Hebrew word representing first is Resh. Thus, Tatub might have been known as Resh Arata, first town on the Arata River. Moses only wrote in consonants, which means that he would have written RRT, which are the 3 letters in Ararat. Well, this is speculative, but it is a possibility. Also, there are 4 hills at Kafadja, thus the name Ararat Hills, or Hills of Ararat. I think this is a much more plausible explanation for the name Ararat Hills than any of the other proposed explanations. Yusuf Majidzadeh identified the Diyala River with the Arata River based on a description by Sargon II. Like the reference of Seg Zubi, the names of the 2 rivers, Arata and Rapa, crossed by Sargon II in his 8th campaign, have been taken as evidence for the location of the land of Arata. The 2 rivers have been identified by Gordon as the Sirwan, that's another name for the Diyala River, and the headwaters of the Diyala. So like I said before, there were 4 hills or mounds at Kafaja that were spread over a distance of about half a mile. The Diyala River or Rata River was at 20 meters, means above sea level at the time of the flood, and it appears that the current height of the hills is in the range of 42 to 45 meters. And that would correspond with what the hills looked like when Moses wrote, probably, in 1600 BC. The 4 hills, so they were substantial, and I think they would have qualified for the name hills or Her of Ararat. I've circled the temple oval in this topographic map of the hill at Kafaja, and this image is oriented in the north-south direction. Normally, temples were aligned in the north-south or east-west directions. However, the temple oval is in an odd angle, such as the ark might have been if it randomly ran aground while the water was flowing over the top of the hill toward the outlet of the Diyala River. Pinhas Delegaz wrote a summary report of the 5 years of excavations at the temple oval, and this image from the report shows the 8-meter thick layer of sand that is under the temple oval. So for some reason, the builders of the temple oval felt the need to excavate the pit under which they placed the temple oval and deposit 8-meter depth of clean river sand. And the workers transported the sand from the Diyala River. The total volume of sand was 64,000 cubic meters. So for comparison, a large dump truck carries 10 yards, which is about the same as a meter of sand. So this was 66,400 dump truck loads of sand, except they didn't have dump trucks. Or let us say they had pickup trucks, which can carry a third of the yard of sand. It would have been 200,000 pickup loads of sand. So anyway, the builders of the temple must have thought it was very important to cover whatever was under the sand with clean river sand. The size of the ark is shown in blue and overlaid on a plan view of the temple oval from the Delegaz report. So the ark, 300 cubits long, is about 10% longer than the temple oval. And the outer walls of the temple correspond with the distance that the walls of the ark would have fallen if they fell outward. So here's a picture of the intact ark, and then if the walls were pushed outward, they would fall out to the distance of the arrows. And I would not be surprised if the inhabitants of Tatub did that in order to prevent the ark from becoming a hazard as the ark decayed. If they pushed it inward, there'd still be all these crevices and things, but if they pushed it outward, then the ark would be probably collapse in a relatively flat shape. So although the archaeologists tried repeatedly to find out what was under the sand during the first 4 years, they were prevented by the water table until the last season. So the first 4 years of the expedition, until the last season when the water table dropped. Finally, in the last season, they were able to dig a shaft that penetrated to the bottom of the sand. So this is the shaft or pit that the Delegaz workers dug into the sand layer. So with our modern rules on workplace safety, this picture just seems like a joke. This is a guy down here at the bottom of 8 meters of sand in a narrow shaft. And I just want to point out the top of the narrow shaft is at the top of the sand layer, which is within another deep pit dug into the temple. So this guy is really down there. So this is a paragraph from the 1940 Delegaz report about what they found at the bottom of the pit. And I'm just going to focus on, well, you can focus on the highlights in red. I'll read the whole thing. Under the sand, the color of the soil was almost black in contrast with all the layers above. The presence of water in the small area of the sounding, for the hole had to be narrowed in cutting through the sand to avoid collapse of the sides, made it impractical to dig there to a great depth. Hence, we only penetrated for about 1 meter into this black deposit. It contained a very large quantity of plain potsherds, all apparently belonging to a type of bowl that survived throughout almost all early periods. So unfortunately, they provide no dating evidence. This layer contained an unusually large amount of reeds and reed matting, particularly well preserved in fairly thick layers, probably on account of the presence of water. The water emitted a very strong sulfurous odor, most likely owing to an unusually large number of organic remains. So in summary, the soil was almost black and had a strong sulfurous odor. And it's possible that the organic remains were the source of the sulfur, but I just want to point out that bitumen is about 5% sulfur. And in addition, there was an extensive amount of reeds and reed matting, which I would expect based on the construction of the ark from reeds. And there was a large amount of pottery from early pots, which could have come from anywhere, but I think there were probably a lot of pots on the ark for food storage. Some of the archaeologists suggested that the sand was placed there to cover a wetland. However, Delegaz had the following response. It has been suggested that this black deposit may indicate that the temple oval was built on swampy ground that was filled in by the layer of sand. It is, of course, possible that marshy ground existed at some time in this area, but if so, it must have been long before the temple oval was built, and it could hardly have been the cause of the sand filling. For in all our soundings around the oval, we invariably found that some earlier buildings had been cut away before the sand was thrown in. Moreover, in several places outside the oval, we reached considerably lower levels and found that buildings existed even below the present water table. It seems certain, therefore, that the ground was lower in ancient times than it is now, and that the accumulation of ruins removed in order to make place for the sand must have been at that time literally high and dry. So based on the unusual sand layer, the shape and dimensions of the temple, the name of Harada Hills, anyway, the proposed name of Harada Hills, and the corresponding remains under the sand layer, I think it is likely that these are the remains of the ark. And because this area is now surrounded by agriculture and likely pumping, I think it is likely that the water table has dropped and archaeologists could investigate the materials under the temple oval. Okay, finally, let's look at archaeological and genomic evidence for the activities of Noah after the flood in the Segabi Godentepe area in the Congavar Valley. First, the famous Great Silk Road, which was then known as the Great Khorasan Road, connected the Diyala River Valley to Godentepe, which was a traveler stop along the road. Second, Noah drank wine, and there was wine and beer at Godentepe Segabi. It's known as the only place with wine and beer in the centuries after the flood. Third, Noah was from the Uruk culture, and there was evidence of Uruk cultures in Segabi Godentepe in the centuries after the flood. And finally, genomic analysis indicates that the bloodline of Adam and Eve acquired Chalcolithic Zagros DNA at the time of the flood. So the Chalcolithic was the period prior to the flood, and the only Chalcolithic Zagros DNA that I know about is from Segabi. So once the ground dried, Noah and his family and probably the animals would have walked out of Mesopotamia. It would have been barren and uninhabitable. Many could stop off in the Diyala Valley beyond the extent of the flood. I mean, I'm referring to animals. However, Noah kept going and walked upstream along the Diyala River in order to exit Mesopotamia. I'm not sure about that, but I imagine he was tired of Mesopotamia at that point. And so this yellow line marks the Great Khorasan Road, at least the part that goes to Segabi, and Godentepe is right next to it. The Congavar Valley would have provided a suitable location for Noah to establish his family after the flood and begin farming, specifically growing grapes. And one thing I was thinking is maybe Noah learned to make wine on the ark from decaying fruit or something. So I'm not an archaeologist, and I don't want to pretend to interpret archaeological data, although I just did. But Noah was from the Uruk culture, and there is evidence of Uruk visitors in Godentepe after the flood. I will just read a statement by Schwartz and Hollander about the period after the flood. Godin Tepe may represent a colony of a type similar to Hasanebi, an enclave of Uruk settlers within a pre-existing local community. While Hasanebi is located in the upper Euphrates region, Godin is also strategically located, but in the highlands of Iran on the historical Khorasan Road that ran from southern Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau. Uruk Mesopotamian material was found within an oval enclave inside of the local settlement. Like Hasanebi, a local community had existed before Mesopotamian contact. The fort-like structure on top of the site had a range of Uruk Mesopotamian ceramics in addition to tablets and cylinder seal impressions that included iconographic signs found in the earliest archaic texts from Uruk Orkha. This Godin period 6 occupation was originally interpreted to be a colonial outpost made up of a small number of merchants from Mesopotamia. However, ceramic data does not support the idea of a permanent occupation and instead suggests that Uruk pottery was manufactured by locals at the site. Contact with southern Mesopotamia is not debated, however, and it seems likely that at the very least, traders from the Uruk heartland were involved in some trade-related activities here. So whatever that means. As almost everybody probably knows, Noah planted a vineyard and drank wine after the flood. And the region had a suitable climate for growing grapes. Nearby Lake Zerabar had some of the first evidence of domesticated grape production in the region in 4300 BC. And as far as I know, as I've already said, this was the only location with wine and beer in the years after the flood. Joshua Mark, who wrote some sort of online encyclopedia, I'm forgetting the specific name right now, described evidence of beer and wine at Godin Tepe. Both beer and wine were brewed at Godin Tepe as evidenced by finds in clay jars dating to this period. The means of producing both beer and wine seems to have been discovered concurrently, 3500 to 3100 BC, but which came first remains unclear. There is controversy among modern scholars whether beer or wine was first produced at Godin Tepe, but the preponderance of evidence favors beer. Finally, genomic evidence. So genomic evidence indicates that Adam and Eve, specifically Jews and Canaanites, originated in 5800 BC. The next phase of the genomic history of Jews and Canaanites was the addition of Chalcolithic Zagros mountain DNA at the time of the flood in 3500 BC. So here's where I have the original DNA coming from, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And then 3500 BC, their descendants, for some reason, acquire Segavi DNA. So as far as I know, I don't know of any other skeletons from the Chalcolithic, which was the period before the flood. Approximately 40% of the DNA in Jews and Canaanites comes from this region at this time. So, and it's also interesting that the lifespan of Adam's descendants also began to decrease at this point, indicating intermarriage. So in summary, there's evidence of Noah's presence in Segabi in the form of wine, a root culture, Jewish and Canaanite DNA, and Segabi was connected by the Great Khorasan Road to Kafaja, so Noah might have gone there after the flood. Thank you for listening.